The hardest part of building a city on Mars isn't surviving there. It's planning for the moment when nobody plans to leave. Crossing the planning threshold. There is a quiet but critical moment in a long-term settlement effort when the problem changes. You stop asking how to survive and start asking how to live. The transition is not marked by population size, by the arrival of a particular technology, or even by economic self-sufficiency. It is marked by intent. A base exists to accomplish a task. A city exists because people expect to remain. It is no longer the mission or a project, it's home. That distinction matters enormously on Mars because the design choices that make a base efficient often make a city fragile. A base is optimized for throughput, specialization, and replacement. A city must be optimized for persistence, redundancy, and failure tolerance. If early Martian settlements are designed too much like extended missions, they will struggle the moment they become permanent by default, which history suggests they will. And it's the reality of discussions about the Red Planet that we often focus on either the first missions or some distant terraformed future, while the early years of genuine settlement get skimmed over, partly because it's hard to imagine why people would take their families there in the first place. This episode is not about getting humans to Mars, nor is it about the first habitats placed there, nor is it about terraforming. Those questions have been covered extensively here and elsewhere, and the answers have not fundamentally changed. Mars is still hostile, thin-aired, cold, irradiated, and distant. What has changed is that we are no longer talking exclusively about outposts. We are now seeing serious discussions about multi-decade presence, families, governance, and local continuity. That is the point at which city planning begins, whether or not anyone intended it to. The first mistake planners tend to make is assuming that a city is just a large base. It is not. A base cannot afford to be brittle. A city cannot. A brittle system works well right up to the moment it fails, and then fails catastrophically. In a research outpost, that may be acceptable. If a component breaks, operations halt until repaired or replaced. Personnel are rotated, evacuated, or replaced. In a city, failure modes must be graceful. Power outages cannot cascade into a loss of atmosphere. Medical care cannot depend on a single specialist. Food systems cannot assume perfect logistics. Redundancy is no longer inefficiency, it is survival. And it is not the survival of the best and brightest, your Apollo 13 crew or Mark Watney, who will stay cool under pressure and never give up. A city is made of regular people, including children and parents that may be too worried about their children to focus on the current problem. You need emergency services because you are no longer composed entirely of people completely capable and focused on handling any crisis that arises. If you don't factor that into your setup, your first city on Mars will disappear into the red sands. This is the planning threshold, the moment where the goal shifts from doing work on Mars to supporting a population that is not going anywhere. That threshold arrives far earlier than many people expect. It does not require millions of residents. It does not even require tens of thousands. It requires children. It eventually requires aging residents and pets. Things are very different when your settlement or outpost consists entirely of single workaholics, assigned specific missions they have been thoroughly trained in and have nothing to do socially but to talk to their fellow workaholics. As families grow on site or immigrate from home, focus shifts. And this can be good too, because it is also where a truly local economy is going to emerge from. This is why planning for the first Martian cities cannot begin at the point where terraforming becomes feasible or large domes are economical. It must begin much earlier, when the settlement is still enclosed, still artificial, and still overwhelmingly dependent on external support, but already socially permanent. At that stage, several constraints dominate city planning in ways that are easy to underestimate. First, Mars cities will be infrastructure heavy in a way Earth cities are not. On Earth, infrastructure supports life. On Mars, infrastructure is life. Air pressure, temperature, radiation shielding, and water recycling are not background utilities. They're the city's skeleton. This flips a common intuition. On Earth, buildings exist inside an environment. On Mars, the environment exists inside the buildings. That has immediate planning consequences. Streets are not open spaces. They are pressure vessels and may be buried underground. Extra steps up and down might even be seen as a handy way to keep muscles and bone density up on a planet with 38% of normal gravity. Parks are not exposed land, they are engineered volumes, and zoning is not aesthetic, it's survival architecture. At the base stage, separating systems is mostly about efficiency and safety. At the city stage, it becomes mandatory. Multi-level or tiered districts preserving separation between life support loads, industrial hazards, residential areas, medical spaces, and emergency routes. A residential district and an industrial district are not just separated by noise considerations, but by catastrophic risk profiles. The landing site is far away and connected by a tunnel, and may even have a raised curtain wall or blast berm between it and the settlement to mitigate a rocket blowing up on the pad. That is not a particularly improbable event either. Second, Mars cities cannot be optimized for peak performance. They must be optimized for continuous underperformance. Every system must assume it will be operating below ideal conditions, with delayed maintenance, limited spares, and partial staffing. As much as I love space development and can justify many outposts on Mars for science or prestige, I see little benefit to a city on Mars to people back on Earth footing the bill. There is nothing on Mars materially that we need. The cost to send goods there is appropriately astronomical. It is both a financial and psychological necessity that they achieve reasonable self-sufficiency early. This need not mean total self-sufficiency. In fact, trade should be actively encouraged. Exchanging specialized goods and surpluses is the backbone of any durable economy, and it builds mutual reliance and confidence rather than isolation. Nor does a settlement need to run at a net surplus or break even, especially in its early decades. A Martian colony of even several thousand people could reasonably be subsidized in multiple ways. One obvious path is research funding, paying scientists, engineers, and technicians to conduct experiments and to build or maintain infrastructure that benefits humanity as a whole. We employ roughly 30,000 geologists in the United States alone, not counting the many additional specialists who support their work. A Martian settlement whose primary mission was simply studying Martian geology, advancing our understanding of planetary formation, tectonics, resource processes, and geology in general, all of which are vital to modern economies, could plausibly support thousands of people for centuries on that basis alone. Geology is the most obvious example. We are to operate many large scientific and engineering projects that require effectively an entire support town to function, from major research facilities to military bases. And while people may sometimes argue about whether a given project is worth the cost, I've never heard anyone seriously claim that teachers, shop owners, technicians, or medical staff supporting these projects are somehow non-productive. Needless to say, you do have to worry about a ghost town if that main project ends, and unlike the Wild West, a Martian ghost town's population doesn't really have many options for where to go. Potential immigrants are going to want some assurances that those options will exist so their town can continue on rather than its population turning to ghosts themselves. With that in mind, another approach to use instead or in tandem could be through direct support to residents themselves. Imagine a policy where a nation or coalition decides it wants a permanent human presence on Mars and commits to it explicitly. For the next 100 years, or until the colony reaches, say, 10,000 native births, it provides every resident with a modest stipend, perhaps $1,000 a month or the equivalent in credits for 3D printer time, communication bandwidth, or entertainment access. In absolute terms, this is a trivial expense, measuring in the low millions per year. Conceptually, it would be a modernized version of historical land grants and pioneer incentives, designed to encourage settlement and permanence and to give potential entrepreneurs a safety net. And again, that would be minimal. SpaceX thinks they may be able to get the cost to get a person to Mars for less than $1 million. But right now, the shipping price range is something like $100,000 a kilogram or $45,000 a pound. So you might be spending tens of millions of dollars to get each new person there, and several million in support cargo that can't be made in situ every year. But for context, if it were $100 million for each person in their basic kit, and $10 million per year to support, a base population of 100 people is only costing $10 billion to build and $1 billion a year to support. That's easy to keep financed by the public indefinitely, and even with a $100,000 a year bonus per person, that would only be another $10 million a year. When we get to 1,000 folks, now that's a $100 billion investment with a $10 billion a year upkeep. Eventually, such a support would end or need to get diluted or phased out, and almost certainly not without controversy. Some would argue it was withdrawn too soon, others that it lingered too long, propping up the lazy Martians. But as a transitional mechanism, it remains entirely viable. It helps bridge the gap between an early, subsidized outpost and a mature settlement that is largely self-sufficient, while reinforcing the idea that the residents are productive, valued members of humanity doing work that matters. People we could view as paragons rather than parasites. Now, I mentioned potential entrepreneurs, and some folks might travel to Mars specifically to set up some business, complete with funds and investors to give them time to get things running properly. But a lot of times this would just be a perceived need, and someone there already doing another job wanting to fill it, and unsure if they should make the leap. At this point, you might be wondering what those first local businesses actually look like, and the answer is probably a bar. Most likely, it starts unofficially. An after-hours operation with the tacit approval of Mission Command, or at least their decision to look the other way. Bill the botanist begins experimenting with making hooch out of leftover plant matter or surplus crops, partly out of curiosity and partly because morale matters. Word spreads, a couple of stools appear, someone brings music, someone else brings a table and a deck of cards. The first social place on Mars is born. The first commercial export too. Someone is bound to buy the first bottle of Martian Red, even if it was so bad, any decent bartender would dump it down the drain. And even if the price to bring a bottle home was more than an entire vineyard cost. Not long after that first still, though, you get a general store. At first it mostly sells clothes, basic comforts, and candy. You might still be using ration cards rather than cash at this stage, but the function is the same. A place where people can choose, not just receive. Then Bill starts getting bored. His official job hasn't changed much. He is repeating the same experiment with different plants, while his new apprentice, fresh from Earth, does most of the heavy lifting, tweaking soil and nutrient mixtures, waiting months for harvest, collecting data. Bill's enthusiasm is increasingly focused on experimenting with those plants as basis for alcohol or flavor additives. His supervisors back home are beginning to hint that maybe they don't need two people doing that job anymore, especially since he seems to be checked out. At that point, there's a decision to be made. Either Bill gets replaced and sent home, or he finds a new role. But Bill is popular, and the outpost commander very much wants that after-hours bar to keep existing. So a compromise emerges. They build a proper bar. Bill shifts to part-time work in the botany lab. His assistant gets promoted. Everyone wins. That very human process repeats itself again and again with small variations. They only ship about 100 pounds of sweets to Mars per year for the settlement of 100. 1 pound each. Everyone has ration cards they can use at the outpost commissary, which is only open a couple hours a day at first, because there are only 100 people total, and the person running it, Candy, has a primary job of her own. She repairs spacesuits and uniforms most of the time. When the clothes wear out but are still better than rags, she sews them into non-work clothes or quilts, but the first thing she sewed was a ragtag Martian flag. Candy has a sweet tooth, and she quickly notices that some of her peers don't care much for them. They are willing to trade, sometimes for their ration items, sometimes for help with the project. Eventually, she gets the commander's approval to set up a small trade alcove in the commissary, where people can leave items they don't want in exchange for things they do. It supplements private trades and even the occasional card game stake. Meanwhile, Botany Bill mentions that his brewing buddy, Cody the chemist, has gotten quite good at extracting sugars from plant surpluses. He's been experimenting with rock candy and caramel. Candy gets permission to set aside a bit of commissary space for consignments. She takes a small commission. So does the base. Now the commander has something useful on hand. Supplies for throwing the occasional party. Small rewards for people who do something impressive, and for something more tangible than a certificate, especially since the base has a very limited supply of blank certificates and printer toner anyway. And without anyone formally planting it, a local economy has begun. Sometimes this process looks like someone changing careers, as we saw above, and it's very likely among the overachievers who will make up early settlements. Sometimes it's a spouse who needs a job, or who realizes that the one they arrived with doesn't really matter in this new context. We see a good fictional example of this in Deep Space Nine. Miles and Keiko O'Brien arrive at a remote outpost that desperately needs a chief engineer, keeping Miles very busy, but doesn't really need a botanist. What it does have is a growing population of children with nothing to do. So Keiko ends up founding the station's first school instead. In reality, a wormhole opening out to an unexplored region of the galaxy would absolutely need a botanist cataloging samples, but the story made the right choice. It showed how people adapt when the needs of a settlement don't match the roles they were trained for. And that's not a total tangent. A lot of characters in long-range shows don't really find their footing until a season or two in. Sometimes it's the show that jumps the shark. Sometimes the character who finally grows in their role. Early outposts and settlements are likely to behave the same way. They won't know what they really are at first. Martian history probably won't remember Botanist Bill for his botany. Instead, they'll remember Mars' first bar, Botany Bay, as the place everyone gravitated after work, and as a setting for the opening chapter of a lot of early Martian history and tall tales. Candy won't be remembered for running a consignment shelf or repairing spacesuits. She'll be remembered for sewing the first Martian flag and making the first wedding dress for the first marriage on Mars. Not everyone changed roles, of course. That early commander might simply become the first Martian mayor or governor, but that's the point. The mission isn't just exploration of space, it's the growth of humanity. The people who go there will grow too, often in ways nobody planned. And when that happens, when people stop thinking of themselves as a crew performing a mission and start thinking of themselves as people living their lives, that's when Outpost becomes a settlement, and a settlement starts down the path toward becoming a city. But once people begin improvising in society, the architecture has to expect improvisation too. An outpost that starts behaving like a settlement cannot remain just a set of habitat modules. It becomes an urban system. You're not designing a habitat where people can survive between work shifts. You're designing a place people can keep living in while other people are repairing it, expanding it, arguing about it, raising kids in it, running businesses in it, and trying to decide what sort of civilization they are accidentally becoming. And that is a very different requirement. A city originally designed like a spacecraft eventually accumulates unplanned modifications, workarounds, and societal dependencies that the original architecture never anticipated. On Mars, that transition begins immediately. Improvisation isn't the phase you graduate out of. It's the steady state. So the first rule of planning Martian cities is to design for change. Specifically design so that changes don't couple failures together. That starts with segmentation. A city can't be a single pressure value with a single life support backbone. Districts or blocks can be isolated if there's a fire, chemical contamination, depressurization, or disease outbreak. The more the city grows, the more it needs the equivalent of fire doors, pressure locks, and bypass corridors built into its very layout. People often imagine this as a safety feature. It's more basic than that. It's what allows maintenance and construction to happen without shutting down everyone's lives. Incidentally, some of the visuals you're seeing here today come from Inception, an upcoming Mars mission simulator created by Bryan Versteeg of Spacehab Studios, a longtime friend of the show, the winner of the National Space Society's 2025 Space Pioneer Award for compelling art, and one of the best people I know at making future space settlements feel real, stunning, and scientifically accurate. There's a link to the Inception Steam page in the comments below. Go check it out after the episode and help design and execute our future on the Red Planet. Many of these design choices come down to how long humans can go without something, and whether there are practical stopgaps when systems fail. You've probably heard the rule of threes, about 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. The intuitive conclusion is that oxygen systems must never go down for more than a few minutes. In practice, it's more subtle than that. A cube-shaped room roughly 3 meters, about 10 feet outside, filled with normal air, actually contains around 10 days worth of oxygen for one resting person. What becomes dangerous much sooner isn't the lack of oxygen, but the buildup of carbon dioxide, which can reach hazardous levels in a day or two. The good news is that carbon dioxide scrubbers scale extremely well. A unit size for one person, good for several days, can be as small as a lunchbox or suitcase and quite durable. That's why emergency planning in space isn't really about strapping on oxygen tanks. What matters far more is having CO2 scrubbers in each room, all simple pressure patches and liquid sealants that can hold a leak long enough for help to arrive. More importantly, this means you don't actually need multiple backup oxygen generators. In a large base, you have a surprising amount of time to fix an oxygen problem. Oxygen is easy to make if you have energy. You can electrolyze water, superheat or chemically process common rocks, or tap into systems that are already running. Any early base that is refining local regolith or producing fuel is almost certainly generating oxygen as a waste byproduct anyway. The real challenge isn't producing breathable air, rather it's keeping that air clean. Dust, microbes, and chemical contaminants built quickly in a closed-loop system, and managing them reliably at scale in ways that allow steady expansion without importing fragile, expensive hardware from Earth is one of the quiet but central problems of motion city planning. In terms of layout, you don't have any motivation to have empty streets exposed to the sky. You cover them, even if you don't plan to keep them pressurized to help cut down on dust and contain any blowout from a neighboring wall. You might not care much about escaping oxygen and carbon dioxide, but nitrogen and water are in that air too and harder to replace there. You also build a lot more 3D, because gravity is so low that it's basically trivial to go up and down stairs, or to dig out and support underground spaces. Food for thought, incidentally, is that your settlement probably uses a lot of stairs and maybe even fire poles and tethers for easy movement around. Your initial crew of overachievers would be in peak physical health, which is handy when working in a hostile and dangerous environment far from home. So, what happens when one of them breaks a leg or snaps their spine? Even if you're sending them home, odds are the next transport is months off. Are you building with such handicaps in mind from the outset, or retrofitting when need arises? Admittedly, with low gravity, crutches will probably work fine enough even on stairs. Similar concerns arise for psychological crises, though, which we should expect to be much more common to arise and get worse for folks living 100 million miles from home on some godforsaken frozen dust ball lit by anemic sunlight and separated from death by thin module walls. Is your outpost ready for someone in a panic, breakdown, or moment of rage trying to smash a window open to get some fresh Martian air? How big can you grow before you need to make sure you're not catastrophically vulnerable to such problems? If it's 1% per person per year, then you've got a problem before you reach 100 people, especially if some of those people are curious 4-year-olds born there who want to hit the red button or latch. Maybe you don't need a whole meter of local regolith mounted up outside your middle wall or ceiling to be safe. Maybe half that would do, but how much to make everyone feel safe and not be distracted by fear and anxiety? Segmentation also changes how you think about streets. On Mars, a street is an engineered corridor, load-bearing, pressurized, climate-controlled, and full of hidden access panels. It is not a void between buildings. It is a building, one that happens to connect to other buildings. That makes the early city dense by default and makes it grow inward long before it sprawls outward. Every cubic meter of habitable air is something you had to seal, heat, filter, and protect, so volume gets treated like a budget item. The density pushes the city toward a utility-first geometry. Air handling, water loops, power distribution, water processing, heat rejection. These become the true map of the city. People live and work where the pipes, ducts, and cables make it easy to keep them alive. That is the opposite of Earth, where we often route utilities to serve the people. On Mars, especially initially, you route people to serve the utilities. This is also all probably nuclear powered, at least at the backbone level. Solar is still viable on Mars, but takes more area to get the same output, and you need a lot of storage for night, dust storms, and industrial loads that do not politely wait for noon. I think you would still expand using solar, since silicon is plentiful there, and much of the masterful panels and support structures can eventually be made locally, with only the more critical and complex pieces being shipped from Earth. You can run energy-intensive industry during peak sunlight that way, but a city needs baseload power, and nuclear's big advantage is not just that it is compact, it is predictable. Predictable power means predictable maintenance, replacement schedules, emergency planning, and spare parts inventories. That matters enormously when your supply chain is another planet. Batteries are not just mass either, they are equipment with finite lifetimes, replacement cycles, fire risks, and their own safety infrastructure. Solar panels, batteries, and other storage systems can absolutely improve in the decades before a settlement of 100 plus people exists on Mars, and progress in any one of those could change the balance. For now, a nuclear reactor remains the strongest candidate for supporting hundreds to thousands of people without needing a huge on-site production chain from day one. This is part of why zoning by hazard profile becomes the default. Nobody wants to live next to a reactor, and even using water that was cooling it to pump around the habitats to heat them might make folks a bit nervous, especially when babies start living in those habitats. So too, the industrial district isn't across the town because it's ugly. It's separated because a chemical spill, a pressure accident, or a machinery fire must not threaten residential life support. Likewise, medical spaces sit where the environment is most stable: clean air, reliable power, minimal vibration, predictable access. It's a city built around failure modes and redundancy. The next planning constraint is time delay. Mars is close enough to feel connected to Earth, but far enough that external control becomes unworkable. You cannot run a city whose urgent decisions require a committee on another planet. That means local authority becomes an engineering requirement, not an ideological one. Emergency services, utility control, allocation of scarce resources, and dispute resolution need decision power on site, though this does not preclude off-board assistance and oversight. The original leader is almost certainly appointed, but if the settlement belongs to a democratic nation, its residents will be still voting from afar, much like people stationed in Antarctica do. And at some point, they all likely want a say in local leadership too, electing their own mayor, choosing a council of advisors for the appointed commander, or at least being polled on major decisions about the settlement's direction. I think once you start having a civilian economy, people start wanting civilian leadership and some say over it. And this is where our base logic breaks down fastest. In a base, the chain of command is rigid and mission-focused. In a city, it becomes layered. You need administrators who are not commanders, judges who are not engineers, and managers who are not astronauts. You need rules that are legible to the ordinary citizens, not just procedures that trained crew can follow. Population stability changes the architecture too. Rotating crews accept inconvenience and discomfort because they know it ends. Almost any hardship can be tolerated if there's a known expiration date. Permanent residents do not have that luxury. As we said earlier, a city is not made entirely of Apollo 13 crews. It is made of normal people. Children, parents, folks who are exhausted, distracted, sick, grieving, just having a very bad week. So you need designs that assume imperfect performance from residents. That means wide margins, simple interfaces, idiot-proofing, and a lot of physical cues that reduce error. It also means that you build emergency response as a civic institution, not as everyone is trained for everything. In the earliest phase, everyone really might be cross-trained. A decade later, that becomes impossible. Specialization returns, and with it you need firefighters, EMTs, inspectors, safety officers, and all the unglamorous roles that make cities resilient. There is also a psychological layer, and it's not optional. People can survive in a hostile environment indefinitely. They cannot build a stable society in an environment that constantly screams danger, though. The city needs spaces that communicate normalcy, rhythms, routines, privacy, variety, quiet. It needs leisure areas that aren't just recreation modules, but places with identity, neighborhoods that feel like neighborhoods. If everything feels like a corridor, the city will feel like a prison no matter how safe it is. The city needs personalization. All of this feeds into the big architectural question people always ask: domes or underground? For the first Martian cities, the key point is the city is unlikely to be a single thing. It will be a layered system. Surface structures exist, but mostly as work sites, power generation, construction yards, landing zones, mine access, and transport nodes rather than places people live. One of the earliest transformative additions is a greenhouse. It allows food production on site, provides a test bed for long-term agriculture, and closes several critical loops at once. Plants absorb carbon dioxide, help purify water, and convert waste into something useful. You wouldn't pump raw waste directly into crops, but processed waste can be fed into bioreactors, tumbler vats filled with processed local regolith, bacteria, and algae, and the resulting material becomes soil. Processed regolith here does not mean scooping raw Martian dust into lettuce beds. It means washing, sorting, chemically treating, sterilizing, and blending into controlled growth medium. Condensation collected from greenhouse walls can be recycled into drinking water. Many early greenhouse designs would likely include central pools or perimeter moats. These serve multiple purposes: housing fish or algae, storing water, and acting as a thermal mass. Water warmed during the day helps stabilize temperature at night, reducing energy demands. We've covered these systems in more depth in earlier episodes on domes and farming on Mars, but the important point here is that greenhouses aren't just farms, they are life support infrastructure. Beyond that, the bulk of the living city initially remains buried, shielded, and compartmentalized. Subsurface habitats offer radiation protection, thermal stability, and easier pressure containment. Over time, larger communal volumes appear, additional greenhouses, parks, atriums, and public spaces. But these are expensive in mass and energy. They emerge only as a city earns the ability to spend value on beauty and identity, not just survival. That transition becomes much easier once the settlement gains the manpower and industrial capacity to mass-produce glass or other transparent materials locally, not just for domes and windows, but also for solar panels and light management systems. Which brings us to economics, because none of this persists unless it has a reason to. This month we've been talking about outsider aliens, dangerous species, fluorine-based life, and creatures shaped by environments very different from our own. But whatever chemistry life uses, evolution still rewards the builds best suited to the local environment. That's the idea behind Tierzoo Remastered, which treats the animal kingdom like a competitive game, ranking species by their abilities, weaknesses, and ecological strategies. Its remastered, classic shark and whale tier lists explore two very different groups that have dominated the oceans through speed, size, intelligence, teamwork, specialized senses, and some extremely effective builds. It's a fun way to explore zoology, but also a useful framework for reimagining alien ecosystems, like void sharks and space whales. Strange features are not there merely to look exotic, they are adaptations shaped by the rules of their world. You can watch Tierzoo Remastered on Nebula, on my full SFIA catalog, monthly exclusives, bonus episodes, and regular episodes early and ad-free. My link or the QR code gets you 50% off an annual plan, or 40% off lifetime access. Martian cities do not need to be profitable in the way a private business must be profitable. They only need to be valuable in the way Antarctic stations, major research facilities, and military bases are valuable, as projects a civilization chooses to fund because it wants the capability, the knowledge, or the presence. This only permits so much growth, even in a post-scarcity society, but that comfortable maximum is likely at least many thousands, and that is more than is needed to create our first cities on Mars. And emphasis on cities. I can well imagine the US having one big Mars base many other countries and corporations used and hope to fund, but I don't think that would last too long before various rivals or even allies wanted their own place. Plus, there's a real advantage to satellite installations compared to one big mega-complex. And that also helps get trade rolling, and trade matters. Trade is not a failure of self-sufficiency, it is a marker of integration. A Martian city that exports nothing and imports everything is fragile. A Martian city that exports even a narrow set of specialized goods, services, and expertise, scientific results, operational experience, unique manufacturing, cultural products, becomes part of a network. Networks are harder to abandon than isolated projects. And there is one more reason cities endure: identity. After a generation, the city doesn't just contain Martians, it creates them. People who grew up under low gravity, under different skies, in enclosed neighborhoods with different habits, dangers, jokes, holidays, and assumptions. They won't measure Mars by the same rubric Earth does. They'll measure it as home. Mars does not get cities because it becomes easy to live there. Mars gets cities because people stay, and because staying changes the problem. Once that happens, the city has to be designed not for a mission, but for a life. Messy life, impromptu life, patchwork life, the kind of life that turns quarters into neighborhoods, work assignments into careers, and temporary shelters into hometowns. A base is where humanity learns to survive on Mars. A city is where Mars becomes part of human civilization.